Gunfire echoed through the valley as Margaret and Eliza Vance crouched behind the overturned wagon, their bodies trembling with fear as the last of the raiders disappeared over the ridge with their families' horses and supplies. The year was 1875, and the sisters had been traveling west with their parents to start a new life in Colorado Territory when the attack came without warning on the dusty trail through the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. "Ma! Pa!" Margaret called out, her voice breaking as the dust settled around them. At 21, she was the elder of the two, with auburn hair now matted with dirt and tears streaming down her face. She crawled toward the front of the wagon where she had last seen her father. Eliza, just 18, remained frozen, her blonde hair hanging in tangles around her ash-streaked face. "Maggie," she whispered, "I can't find them." The bitter truth lay before them. Their parents hadn't survived the raid. Margaret pulled her sister close, their grief mingling as they clung to each other amid the wreckage of their lives. As night fell, the prairie wind howled around them, carrying the scent of sage and gunpowder. "What do we do now?" Eliza asked, her voice small against the vast emptiness surrounding them. "We need to find help," Margaret replied, though she had no idea which way to turn. The raiders had taken their map along with everything else of value. "Come morning, we'll start walking." When dawn broke across the eastern horizon, the sisters gathered what little remained a canteen with a few swallows of water, their mother's locket, and a small knife their father had given Margaret for protection. With heavy hearts, they began walking, each step taking them further from the graves they dug with their bare hands. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Their water was gone, and disorientation set in as the landscape seemed to shift and waver before their eyes. "I think we're going in circles," Eliza said, her lips cracked and bleeding. Margaret squeezed her sister's hand. "We'll find someone, we have to." But as the second day stretched into a third, hope began to fade. They were lost in a sea of prairie grass and rock formations, each looking identical to the last. Eliza collapsed first, her strength giving out beneath the punishing sun. "I can't go any further, Maggie," she whispered. Margaret knelt beside her sister, using her body to shield Eliza from the sun. "Just rest a little. We'll keep going soon." It was as they huddled together, contemplating their mortality, that they heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. "Hello," Margaret shouted with what little strength remained, waving her arms frantically. "Help us, please." The rider approached cautiously, his silhouette wavering in the heat. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out a tall man atop a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Well now," he said, dismounting with fluid grace, "what in tarnation are two young ladies doing out here alone?" "Raiders," Margaret explained, her voice raspy from thirst. "They attacked our wagon train, our parents." The man nodded, understanding filling his deep blue eyes. He removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair and a face weathered by the elements. "Name's William Ingram," he said. "Most folks call me Will. I'm Margaret Vance. This is my sister, Eliza." Will crouched beside Eliza, gently lifting her head and pressing his canteen to her lips. "Easy now, Miss Eliza. Small sips." After Eliza had drunk her fill, he passed the canteen to Margaret. "You ladies are a good 15 miles from the nearest settlement. How long have you been wandering?" 3 days, I think," Margaret replied, feeling strength return as the water coursed through her. Will's expression darkened. "You're mighty lucky I found you. Night's coming, and the coyotes aren't the only predators out here." He stood, surveying the landscape. "I've got a camp a few miles from here. Can you ride?" Margaret looked doubtfully at Eliza, who was still barely conscious. "Don't you worry," Will said, helping Eliza to her feet and lifting her onto his horse. "She'll ride with me. You can walk alongside if you're able." Margaret nodded, grateful for the stranger's kindness. As they moved slowly across the prairie, Will glanced down at her. "You sisters lost your way after the raid," he said quietly. Then, with a gentle firmness that brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes, he added, "You'll never walk alone again." Will's camp turned out to be a small but sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky outcrop, with a corral for his horses and a stream running nearby. Inside, it was spare but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed in one corner. "It ain't much," Will said as he carried Eliza inside and laid her on the bed, "but it's dry and safe." Margaret hovered anxiously as Will tended to Eliza, bathing her face with cool water and mixing a tea from herbs he kept in a wooden box. "Are you a doctor?" Margaret asked. Will chuckled. "No, madam. Just a cowboy who spent enough time alone to learn a few things about staying alive out here." As Eliza slept, Will prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and biscuits. Margaret watched him move around the small space, noting the economy of his movements and the strength in his hands as he worked. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked, accepting the tin plate he offered. "Going on 5 years now." He settled across from her at the table. "Used to ride with a cattle outfit out of Texas, but I got tired of taking orders from men who'd never seen the business end of a branding iron. So you came here." "Worked my way north, did some scouting for the Army, saved up enough to stake this claim." He gestured around the cabin. "It's not much, but every stick and stone belongs to me." Margaret studied him in the firelight. He was older than her, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun, and a quiet confidence that came from surviving in harsh conditions. "What will happen to us now?" she asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her since the raid. Will considered her for a moment. "Well, Miss Margaret, once your sister is well enough to travel, I can take you both to Laramie. There's a stage there that can carry you east if that's what you want." The thought of returning east, to distant relatives who might take them in out of obligation rather than affection, held little appeal. "And if that's not what we want," a slight smile tugged at the corner of Will's mouth, "then I reckon we'll figure something else out." In the days that followed, as Eliza regained her strength, Margaret found herself drawn to Will's quiet competence. He taught her to build a fire that would burn through the night, to identify plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, and to handle his Henry rifle in case of trouble. "You're a quick study," he remarked one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I've always been practical," Margaret replied. "Our father used to say I had more sense than sentiment." Will nodded. "That'll serve you well out here." "But there's room for sentiment too." He gestured toward the stunning panorama before them. "Hard not to feel something when you look at that." Margaret felt a flutter in her chest at the way the fading light illuminated his profile. "It is beautiful," she agreed, though she wasn't entirely sure she was still referring to the sunset. Inside the cabin, Eliza was recovering rapidly. Her natural vivacity returned, and she peppered Will with questions about his life as a cowboy, his travels, and his plans for the future. "I aim to build up my herd," he told her over breakfast one morning. "Got 15 head now, but good breeding stock. In a few years I could have 100. "And you manage them all yourself?" Eliza asked, impressed. Will laughed. "During calving season I hardly sleep, but mostly, yes. Though I've been thinking of taking on help." Margaret, who had been mending one of Will's shirts, looked up. "Is there much demand for ranch work around here?" "For men, yes. For women." Will hesitated. "It's a hard life for a woman alone." "We're not alone anymore," Eliza pointed out with the directness of youth. "We have you." Will's eyes met Margaret's over Eliza's head, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of possibility. The following day, Will announced he needed to check his herd, which was grazing in a valley about an hour's ride away. "Would you like to come along?" he asked Margaret. "Eliza's strong enough to be left on her own for a few hours." Margaret agreed eagerly, partly to escape the confines of the cabin and partly because she'd come to enjoy Will's company. He helped her mount his second horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, and they set off across the rolling landscape. As they rode, Will pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his time in the territory. He spoke of encounters with Cheyenne hunting parties, of surviving blizzards that buried his cabin in snow, and of the solitude that sometimes weighed on him. "Don't you get lonely?" Margaret asked as they paused to water the horses at a small pond. Will considered her question. "I suppose I do, but I'd rather be lonely out here than crowded in some city where a man can't hear himself think." "Our parents were taking us to Denver," Margaret said. "Father had a position waiting with a bank there." "And is that what you wanted? Denver and city life?" Margaret trailed her fingers through the cool water. "I wanted what they wanted for us: security, respectability, suitable marriages. And now—" She looked up at him, at the way the sun highlighted the gold in his beard and the kindness in his eyes. "Now I'm not sure what I want." Will held her gaze. "You've time to figure it out." They continued their ride to check on the cattle, a small but healthy herd grazing peacefully in a lush valley. Will showed Margaret how to approach the animals without startling them and how to recognize signs of illness or injury. "You'd make a fine rancher's wife," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, you've got a good eye for the stock." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. I've always been good with animals." On the ride back to the cabin, a comfortable silence fell between them. The land stretched out in every direction, wild and untamed, yet Margaret no longer felt lost within it. Something was taking root inside her, a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. When they returned, they found Eliza outside the cabin, hanging laundry on a line Will had strung between two posts. "I thought I might as well make myself useful," she explained as they dismounted. "You didn't have to do that," Will said, though his expression showed he was pleased. "If we're going to stay, we should contribute," Eliza replied matter-of-factly. Will and Margaret exchanged surprised glances. "Stay," Will echoed. Eliza planted her hands on her hips. "Unless you're planning to send us away." "Are you?" "No," Will said quickly. "You're welcome as long as you like. But I assumed you'd want to continue to Denver or return east once you'd recovered." "We have nothing to return to," Margaret said softly. "And Denver was our parents' dream, not ours." Will looked from one sister to the other. "What about your dream?" Margaret didn't have an immediate answer, but Eliza spoke up. "I want to learn everything: how to ride like you, how to shoot, how to survive out here." Will smiled at her enthusiasm. "And you, Miss Margaret?" She met his gaze steadily. "I want a place to belong, people to belong to." Something shifted in Will's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Well then," he said, "I reckon we'd better start planning for winter. It'll be here before we know it." The decision made, they fell into a rhythm of work and companionship. Will taught the sisters everything he knew about frontier life, from preserving food and tanning hides to predicting weather and defending against threats. Margaret proved adept at gardening, expanding the small plot behind the cabin to include a variety of vegetables. Eliza, meanwhile, revealed a natural talent with horses, spending hours in the corral gentling the wild mustangs Will occasionally captured. As summer faded into autumn, Will and Margaret found themselves gravitating toward each other in quiet moments. Their hands would brush as they passed tools back and forth, and their conversations often continued long after Eliza had gone to bed. One evening, as they sat by the fire shelling peas from the garden, Will cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, keeping his eyes on his work, "that the cabin's getting crowded with the three of us." Margaret's heart sank. Was he about to suggest they should leave after all? "I've got timber cut," he continued. "Been meaning to add on a proper bedroom. With winter coming, might be good to have the extra space." Relief washed over Margaret. "That sounds wonderful. I could help with the construction." Will finally looked up, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next day they began work on the addition. Eliza helped too, her youthful energy making up for her lack of building experience. As they worked side by side, passing tools and holding beams in place, Margaret felt a contentment she'd never known before. One afternoon, as they took a break from their labors, Will disappeared into the cabin and returned with something wrapped in a cloth. "Found these when I was gathering supplies in town last month," he said, handing the bundle to Margaret. "Thought you might like them." She unwrapped the cloth to find 2 books, a volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson, and a practical guide to frontier medicine. "Oh, Will," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed covers. "They're perfect." "Remembered you saying how much you missed reading," he said, looking pleased at her reaction. That night, after Eliza had fallen asleep, Margaret read aloud from the poetry book by firelight, her voice soft in the quiet cabin. Will sat listening, whittling a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a bird. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul," Margaret read, "and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." She looked up to find Will watching her, his hand still on the carving. "That's mighty pretty," he said. "Reminds me of you." Margaret set the book aside. "Me, the hope part." Will set down his knife and the half-finished carving. "When I found you and your sister, you were at death's door. But there was still fight in you, still hope." "You gave us reason to hope," Margaret said softly. Will moved to sit beside her on the bench. "Margaret," he said, using her full name for perhaps the first time, "I need to say something, and I'm not much good with words." She waited, her heart quickening. "Before you and Eliza came, I was just existing out here, living day to day, season to season, but now—" He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Now I'm building something, a future." "We both are," Margaret whispered. Will's free hand came up to touch her cheek. "I don't want to presume. You're young and you've had precious little choice in what's happened to you." "I'm choosing now," Margaret said, leaning into his touch. When their lips met, it felt to Margaret like coming home after a long journey. Will's kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched her own awakening desire. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Will pressed his forehead to hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you started getting your color back," he admitted. Margaret laughed softly. "I must have looked a fright." "You looked like the bravest woman I'd ever seen," he corrected her. "Still do." Their courtship unfolded alongside the changing seasons. By the time the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, the cabin addition was complete, a snug bedroom that Will insisted the sisters take, while he slept near the fire. "It's not proper otherwise," he explained, though the look in his eyes when he gazed at Margaret suggested he wished circumstances were different. They celebrated Christmas with simple gifts, a carved wooden horse for Eliza from Will, knitted scarves for Will and Eliza from Margaret, and a small mirror in a handmade frame for Margaret from Eliza. Will's gift to Margaret, however, he saved until they were alone, walking in the crisp evening air under a canopy of stars. "I've been saving this," he said, pulling a small object from his pocket. "It belonged to my mother." In his palm lay a silver ring with a small pearl set in its center. "Will," Margaret gasped. "I'm asking you to be my wife, Margaret Vance," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his eyes. "To build this life with me, proper and true." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh yes, Will." The kiss that followed sealed their commitment, warming them against the winter chill. They were married in early spring by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch on his circuit. Eliza decorated the cabin with early wildflowers, and Will slaughtered a young calf for the celebration. A few neighbors from distant homesteads attended, curious about the cowboy who had suddenly acquired a family. As Margaret stood beside Will, speaking her vows beneath the vast Wyoming sky, she thought of how far she had come from that terrified young woman who had watched her world destroyed by violence. She had found not just safety but purpose, not just shelter but love. That night, after the guests had departed and Eliza had tactfully announced she would sleep in the barn to give the newlyweds privacy, Margaret and Will came together as husband and wife. His touch was reverent, his love expressed in whispered endearments and tender caresses that awakened passions Margaret had never known existed. Afterward, lying in his arms, Margaret traced the scar that ran along his ribs, a souvenir from a long-ago encounter with a wounded buffalo. "Do you ever think about how many things had to happen exactly as they did for us to find each other?" she asked. Will's hand stroked her hair. "I try not to dwell on the raid that took your parents," he said, "but I can't help but be grateful that it led you to me." "I used to think everything happened for a reason," Margaret said. "Now I think we make our own reasons from what life gives us." Will kissed the top of her head. "That's a mighty fine way of looking at it." In the years that followed, the ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew, as did Will and Margaret's family. Their first child, a son they named James after Margaret's father, arrived a year after their wedding. A daughter, Catherine, followed 2 years later. Eliza, now a confident young woman of 23, became known throughout the territory for her skill with horses. She established a small but successful business breaking and training mounts for the army and for wealthy ranchers who valued her gentle methods. "You should think about marriage yourself," Margaret told her sister one day as they watched Eliza work with a spirited black stallion in the corral. Eliza laughed. "And who would have me? I spend more time with horses than people. There's that new doctor in town. He can't seem to take his eyes off you whenever we go in for supplies." A blush colored Eliza's cheeks. "Dr. Bennett is just being friendly." "If you say so," Margaret teased. Later that evening, as Margaret sat on the porch nursing Catherine while James played at her feet, Will joined her, his day's work finished. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, lowering himself onto the bench beside her. "It is," Margaret agreed, leaning into him as he put his arm around her shoulders. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the valley. "Remember what you said to us when you found us?" Margaret asked. "That we'd never walk alone again," Will nodded. "I meant it. I know you did." She looked up at him, at the face that had become as familiar and beloved as her own. "You've kept that promise in ways I never could have imagined." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And I always will, Mrs. Ingram, till my dying day." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, they gathered their children and went inside, closing the door on the wilderness that had once threatened to claim them but had instead become their home. In the years that followed, the Ingram Ranch became a landmark in the territory, a place known for its hospitality and prosperity. Travelers often stopped for a meal and a place to rest, and more than one lost soul found refuge there, just as Margaret and Eliza had once done. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Will surprised Margaret with a proper house built near the original cabin. which now served as a bunkhouse for the ranch hands they employed. "It's magnificent," Margaret breathed as she walked through the rooms with their polished wooden floors and real glass windows. "Nothing but the best for you," Will said, watching her reaction with pride. That night, as they lay together in their new bedroom, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "If someone had told me when we were wandering lost after the raid that this would be my life, I never would have believed them," she said. Will propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the moonlight that streamed through the window. "Do you ever regret it? Not going to Denver, not having the city life your parents planned?" Margaret reached up to trace the lines that time and sun had etched around his eyes. "Not for one moment," she said. "This is where I was meant to be. With you." Will lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss that held the same passion and tenderness as their first. "I love you, Margaret Ingram," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you, William Ingram," she replied. "My cowboy, my heart, my home." Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and pine across the land they had tamed together, a life built from loss and found in love, beneath the endless western sky.